Hello friends, welcome back to my channel EduCare. I am Gemini and today we will be discussing about one of the most important topic as well as interesting topic of 10th biology, which forms the basis of 11th standard, which is heredity and evolution. Okay, first we'll be understanding about the basic definitions of these both topics, and then we'll be diving into all of your questions, okay, which you asked me to explain, which is different kinds of traits with different kinds of organs. All of your doubts will be cleared in this video, so watch it throughout. Okay guys, let's begin by what is heredity. Heredity can also be referred to as inheritance. Okay, what happens when the birth of a new child takes place? You often hear comments, right? She has a nose just like her mom, he has hair just like his dad. These are some of the things that you might have heard. Even you might have sometimes got the comments that this habit of yours is just like your dad, right guys? So such kind of passing of characters from the parents to the offspring is what heredity is. Okay, so let us see the definition of heredity. It is the process of passing traits. By traits, we mean characters, the features that have been passed on. For example, the color of the eye, the color of the skin, the process of metabolism, the speed at which metabolism takes place in your body is also passed on from parents. Imagine that when passed on from the parents to the offspring by which we mean the next generation through the process of reproduction. Now remember, reproduction can also be of two types: asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. In the case of asexual reproduction, the chances which are of passing of variation are quite less as compared to the sexual reproduction. The reason being, only one parent is involved in the case of asexual reproduction. We've looked into the different kinds of asexual reproduction, right? Binary fission, budding. In this, only one organism is required. But in the case of sexual reproduction, both the parents, that is the male, which passes on the sperm to the next generation, the first cell when it has to be formed of the offspring, and in the case of female, the ova passes on. These both fuse together in order to form the first cell, which is zygote, which you might be very well aware of, right? So in the case of sexual reproduction, the chances of variation are quite high as compared to that of asexual reproduction. So I hope you've understood what basically heredity means. Okay, the passing of characters is said to be heredity. Next, what is our main topic of this chapter is evolution. Evolution came into being when these changes occurred over a longer duration of time. Okay, let us understand this with the help of a simple example. Your exams are coming and you decide to do a particular syllabus. You decide to finish a particular syllabus. Now what you make is a timetable. All of you might have tried that, right? Many of them are able to stick to it, but many of them fail to do so. But what happens in making a timetable is at least you try to attain a bit of your part to it, right? So what I was saying is, each day you try to stick to a schedule. Okay, what happens ultimately is you won't be able to see the changes within 1 or 2 of the days, but what happens at the end of the month that you'll realize that so much syllabus you've covered. Okay, same is the case of inheritance and evolution. What changes occur after 1 or 2 generations cannot be noticed easily, but what happens over a period of say 30 years can be noticed, and that is said to be evolution. So what is the definition of evolution? It is the gradual and continuous changes. Okay, you cannot see it in just one step that these changes have occurred, but it is gradual and continuous process of change, okay, that occurs over a period of time. And these changes are really very important, okay, because our environment is continuously changing, okay, because of the pollution, or else you can also say for example, an asteroid hits our earth. Okay, in such cases, some of the generations or some of the species of the organisms get extinct, okay, but they need to adapt if they want to survive. Darwin had given a theory of survival of the fittest, right? Those organisms, those species which are able to survive in the changing environment will be able to go on increasing their population, such as the case of we humans. Imagine the human population was very few as compared to the microorganisms earlier. The bacteria have been living on this earth since many years before we human beings came into existence. But bacteria has also evolved in order to survive. Let us say there was a group of a colony of bacteria which were living in the oceanic waters. They, with the changing environment, they needed to survive. in that hot water. Okay, now what happened was they developed an outer covering which helped them resist that temperature change, and which is why they are still surviving. Okay, so I hope you've understood what is evolution and heredity. Heredity and evolution are the main concepts, and now we'll be looking into some of the basic differences that many of the students have doubts on. Now let us begin by taking in the first difference, okay, which is the difference between genes and alleles. Let us understand this with a simple fact. For example, I make a chit and I write on it that you have to draw a flower pot, and I give to 5 of the students. Now what they'll do is, they'll draw the flower pot according to their imagination, okay. After some time, when I look into all those 5 pictures, I'm sure it might not be the same, right? Same is the case of genes. Now let us first understand what genes are. Genes are a section of DNA that encodes for a certain trait. Now genes are, for example, represented and they are present on a double helix DNA. Okay, so DNA would be present somewhat like this. Okay, now there will be bits and bits of information on this DNA which would represent the gene, and it might possess different kinds of information like the color of the hair, then the color of the eye. Okay, these are some of the features which might be present on this DNA, which is present in a helical form. Okay, and genes are a bits of information which are present on these kind of DNA. Now what happens is, they might be having different variations of the same information that I'm trying to pass. Okay, so if I'm considering color of the hair, then it might be black, brown. Okay, these are different kinds of variants that are present for the for different kind of characteristic. That particular variant would become the alleles. Okay, so what is the basic difference between genes and alleles? Genes represent the information and the variants of these genes represent the alleles. Okay, these genes are the encoding factor. Okay, for example, an architect wants to build a building. What he'll do is, first he'll have to draw the picture of that building on a piece of paper, and after that he'll be executing that particular information that he has encoded on that piece of paper, right? Same encoding you can also be considering for the softwares that are made. There is a front end and back end. In the back end, the encoding needs to be done, and which is shown in the front end that particular program works, right? Such is the case of genes. Fine. So I hope you've understood what genes and alleles are. Genes are a section of information that are present on the DNA, and alleles are its variants. Okay. Now genes can also be understood by considering them to be genotype, okay, and alleles represent the phenotype. Now what do we mean by them? Let us take one more example. Let us consider that these genotype is T, capital T and small t. Now why I have represented this with a capital T and small t, that we will be looking in the next section, but just consider that this capital T represents the feature of tallness, and small t represents the feature of dwarfness, or a person is born short. Okay, now the feature that I am considering here is the height of an organism, but what are its two possible variants? Either tall or else short. Okay, so here the height of the person becomes the genotype. These is passed on from individual parents and they come together and they form alleles. Okay, any of it can be expressed over here, but what will be expressed depends upon the dominant and the recessive trait, which is our next topic. Okay, but genes represent the genotype. Now it is not always possible to express themselves. Okay, that is why it is said to be a genotype. It might be present in the cell or the nucleus of a particular person, but it will not express itself. Let us see this small t. It represents dwarfness, right, students? But it fails to express here itself. Okay, but in the case of phenotype, it always expresses itself. What you see on the exterior of a person represents its phenotype. Okay, genotype may not always express itself, but phenotype always expresses itself. Okay, now one more difference between them is it is present one per gene locus. Okay, so this one feature, just one feature is present per criteria we will be considering. Okay, but in the case of alleles, they are present two per gene locus. For example, we saw here in the case of tallness, right? So this was the difference between genes and alleles. Genes represent the section of information that we'll be considering, and alleles are its variants. I have some questions for you. Can Dhoni, with his capability to hit helicopter shot, can pass on this characteristic or his ability to the next generation? Can Sunidhi Chauhan, with her singing capabilities, pass on these features to her next generation? This is quite confusing, right? Because we are talking about inheritance here, and you might be saying that these characters should also be passed on from one generation to another. So why is it so that some of the things are passed on from one generation, some of the traits, or you can say characters, are passed on from the parent to the next generation, but many of the abilities, many of the skills cannot be passed on from one generation to another? Can the child of every doctor be a doctor? Hard to say. Okay, we cannot answer such questions. But if inheritance is to be confirmed, right, then you might be thinking that it should be passed. So what is basically the difference between the characters being passed and not being passed is what inherited traits and acquired traits are. So what is the definition of inherited traits? The traits that are passed before the birth. Now what do we mean by before the birth? When these changes are present in the the genetics of a particular person, and when the changes occur in those things, then these characters will be passed on from the parent to the offspring. For example, the nucleus contains a DNA, right guys? So whenever the process of reproduction occurs, the egg cell of the female and the sperm of the male fuses together in order to form the first cell of a particular organism, which we call zygote. If the changes are present, if the characters are passed on in that particular cell, then only they will be expressed in the next generation. For example, we discussed about the tallness, the color of the skin, those things we've already discussed, right? So those changes were present in that particular cell, and that is the reason they expressed themselves. But what we acquire throughout our lifetimes, okay, the skills that we get. For example, we took the example of Dhoni and Sunidhi, right? So those things they've acquired, and that cannot be passed on to the next generation. Okay, so such kind of traits are said to be the acquired traits. These traits are acquired after the birth. Whatever they've done is, they've improved the skills on a particular thing. If I want to improve my breathing capability, I'll have to practice a lot, right? So such is the case in the case of acquired traits. Okay, so as discussed earlier, these traits can be transferred to the next generation, the inherited traits. Okay, but these acquired traits cannot be transferred to the next generation. If a woman colors her hair, the natural color she is possessing, that would be transferred and not the color that she has done to her hair, right? And if a person gets hurt at a particular place, the same mark won't be present in a son or daughter, okay? Because the changes which are brought about in those particular cells are the acquired trait. That person has acquired something throughout his lifetime, and it has not been passed on through the genetics of that person, okay? One more difference is present between inherited traits and acquired traits. Inherited traits are the genetic variations, okay? What do we mean by genetic variations is, in their genes those changes are brought about. But in the case of acquired traits, the changes occur in the somatic cells of a person. Whatever cells except the sex cells are present in our body are known as somatic cells, okay? So the cells which are present in our hands, legs are all somatic cells. But in the case of genetic variations, which are the sex cells, or you can see the cells through which the birth of a new organism takes place, those are said to be the genetic variation. What one of the biologists did, he took many mice in order to study these kind of two traits. What he did was, he cut their tails, and he wanted to see whether next generation would possess tails or not. To his surprise, they all possessed tails. He was very much confused, but ultimately he brought about to a conclusion that the changes which were brought about in that particular tails was the somatic variation and not the genetic variation. If the variations occur in the genes, then only it would be passed on to the next generation, but the variations brought about in the other cells of the body cannot be passed on to the next progeny. Okay, so I hope you've understood the difference between inherited traits and acquired traits. What happens when you fight with your sibling? Is your case also the same like mine? My brother always wins, okay? I'm never able to express myself and therefore he always has to win, okay? Same is a case of dominant trait and recessive trait. Dominant trait always wins the race in the case of recessive trait, okay? Let us understand this by taking an example. Now, dominant traits always, remember, are represented with capital letters. Let us continue with the same example that we saw in the earlier segment, okay? Dominant traits are always represented with capital letters. Let us consider a case of height, okay? Dominant trait here would become capital T and recessive traits are represented with small alphabets, okay? So this here would become small t, okay? Now, let us first see the definitions of dominant trait and recessive traits. It is able to express itself even in the presence of recessive trait, okay? Recessive allele also you can call it as, because we have studied earlier that alleles are the different variants of particular genes, right? So, dominant trait would always express itself. It doesn't matter who's present in front of it, okay? But in the case of recessive trait, it is unable to express itself in the presence of dominant trait, okay? Let us consider this further. Capital T and small t, when the crossing occurs, there are three possible variations that we have, okay? Now, when this capital T and small t, height we consider at a factor, capital T, capital T, capital T, small t and small t and small t. These will be the, when crossing over would occur. I'm considering two organisms over here, capital T and small t, and the other organism is also as capital T and small t. When the crossing occurs between them, the three possible variations that are possible here are capital T, capital T, small t, and both of them are small t's, okay? Now, what happens in the first two cases when dominant trait was present? In both of these cases, capital T would always express itself. When will recessive get a chance to express itself? When both the alleles are same, okay? So, dominant is represented with capital letters and recessive is represented with small alphabets. In order for dominant trait to express itself, even if one of the capital T is present, it won't mind who is present with it. May it be capital T or it might be small t. It will always express itself, okay? So what is the other difference of dominant trait and recessive trait? It does not require similar allele to produce its effect, okay? It doesn't matter who's present with it. It will always express itself, okay? Such is the case of dominant trait. But in the case of recessive trait, okay, it produces its phenotypic effect, okay? Means an organism will be born dwarf or else short only when both of the T are, small letters, okay, small alphabets, which would represent the recessive trait, okay? So it reproduces its phenotypic effect only in the presence of a similar allele, okay? So I hope you've understood what dominant trait and recessive traits are. Dominant traits will always dominate. You can remember it through the word itself, okay? The traits which always express themselves are the dominant trait and the recessive traits are the ones. Recessive alleles you can also call them as. It would only express when both of them are small letters. By capital T we mean the tallness and by small t we mean the dwarfness or the short height, okay? And height of a person is the gene that we've considered in this example. Okay students, now we move on to the last segment of a video, which is difference between homologous organs and analogous organs. What is the trick to remember this, Homo means the same and analogous would obviously mean the reverse of it. And guys, this is the most frequently asked question in the 10th board examination, so make it very clear, okay? So see, let's begin again. Homologous organs means those type of organs which have the similar basic structure but have different functions, okay? Let us understand this by taking an example. Consider the forelimb of a human, a frog, and a lizard, okay? In the case of humans, it helps us in grasping things, right? I am able to hold this marker because I am able to grasp the things with the help of the forearm. But what happens in the case of a lizard? It is able to walk on the walls, okay, with its forearm. And what happens in the case of a frog? It is able, with its webbed feet, it is able to even stay in water or float in water for some while, right? So in the case of this example, they all are having the similar basic structure. Their anatomy is the same. Okay, the basic design of the cell is the same as you can see in the picture, but the functions that they perform is totally different. Now reverse is the case of analogous organs. In the case of analogous organs, they have different basic structure, but they perform a similar function. Just the opposite, guys. Okay. Now you can understand this by taking the example of a wing of a bird and that of an insect. They both have completely different structures, or you can say the basic design of the cell, the basic design of the forearms as represented here is totally different, but they perform a similar function, right, of flying. It helps them to fly. Okay, so if the same basic design is there and the functions are different, it is homologous organs. Homo means same, okay, same basic design, and analogous organs means they have a different basic structure but have a similar function. Okay, you can also differentiate it by saying that they have a common ancestor. It is a clear and it is a evident picture of how evolution works. Okay, this is a proof of how evolution, these organisms came to being evolved. Okay, and homologous organs can also be a proof of divergent evolution. You understand? From one organism, many of the different kinds of organisms have evolved. Okay, so this is a proof of divergent evolution, whereas in the case of analogous organs, they are not having a common ancestor, but they are referring to a common function, and in that case it would become a convergent evolution. Okay, many organisms but a similar function. So you can see clearly that these are the different, just the opposite. Okay, homologous organs and analogous organs. So I hope with this video you've clearly understood all the basic concepts of heredity and evolution. If you have any doubts, comment down below and I'll be getting to it very soon. Thank you for watching.